From the first underwater nuclear test at Bikini Atoll in 1946, and a Soviet-era nuclear torpedo exploding in the remote waters of northern Russia, to a 9-kiloton blast in the Pacific Ocean that tested the durability of battleships, and a 5,000-foot wall of water created by Operation Umbrella, here is every underwater nuclear test that was caught on camera. It was August 25th of 1945. World War II was in its final week, and the United States was sitting on a plethora of captured Japanese warships. They had already dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. However, those in Congress wanted to know what their new toys would do in the open ocean. You know, in case we ever needed them again. The idea circulated through the U.S. military. On October 16th of 1945, the Navy agreed to test the bombs on captured vessels. Those associated with the Manhattan Project were hesitant at first. They didn't believe further testing was necessary as it would be hazardous to the environment. A study out of Los Alamos warned that the water near a recent surface explosion will be a witch's brew of radioactivity. Nevertheless, the Army got enough people on board to go through with the testing. Now, they just had to find the right spot. Enter the lagoon of Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. It had everything our testers were looking for. It was an area controlled by the United States, its inhabitants could be easily evacuated, and it was 3,000 miles away from the nearest city. There was also an air base within 1,000 miles, so B-29s could fly in, drop the bomb, and fly out. On July 1st of 1946, a fleet of 95 target ships took position in the lagoon. The testers also placed animals on the ships to study the effects of radiation. As you can imagine, animal rights groups weren't too pleased. At 0900 hours, a B-29 bomber flew over the lagoon and dropped the first payload, a 23-kiloton Fat Man. It detonated 520 feet above the target fleet. The blast sank 5 warships and damaged many others. Next, they wanted to know how an underwater blast would affect the fleet. On July 25th of 1946, they detonated another nuke 90 feet below the surface. The underwater explosion tossed a massive amount of radioactive water onto the decks of their target ships. The resulting shockwave sank 8 more vessels, including an aircraft carrier. In the end, both tests sank 14 ships. That doesn't include the ones that were scuttled due to contamination. So you know, a 1-kiloton explosion is equivalent to detonating 1,000 tons of TNT. So, a 23-kiloton explosion is like detonating 23,000 tons of TNT. The scary part is that's nothing compared to the weapons available today. On May 14th of 1955, 30 ships carrying 6,800 personnel gathered about 500 miles southwest of San Diego. They were there to witness the testing of the Mark 90 Betty, a 30-kiloton nuclear device. The United States developed the Betty in 1952 during the Cold War. It stood 10 feet tall and weighed over 1,200 pounds. They built it to serve as an anti-submarine weapon. Betty carried a Mark 7 nuclear warhead, also known as Thor. Thor was the first weapon delivered using the toss method, which is when the bombing pilot pulls up and releases the payload with an upward trajectory. Ideally, this compensates for gravity and avoids overflying. They rigged the Betty to an unmanned barge and sailed into waters that were 16,000 feet deep. Then, they lowered the bomb to a depth of 2,000 feet. To test its power, they set up various objects along a 6-mile tow line between the barge and the USS Tawasa. Meanwhile, the ships and personnel were stationed 5 miles upwind from the blast zone. Originally, they planned on using actual U.S. submarines as test dummies for Operation Wigwam, but that plan was quickly shut down for a very simple reason. It was too expensive. As a compromise, they developed a fake submarine that had all the most important features of modern subs. Of course, those fake subs, among other supplies and people, had to get to the testing site. Personnel and equipment traveled from every corner of the country to reach the port in San Diego, and eventually the Wigwam testing site. Massive containers full of equipment were loaded onto battleships. Most of that equipment included various recording devices. These guys measure everything when it comes to nuclear testing. However, it was essential to have backups and backups to the backups in case the test subs suffered too much damage. Once everything was in place, they wisely evacuated all ships within the testing zone. Then they prepared for H-hour, when Wigwam finally went boom. At 1 p.m., the device detonated, creating a massive underwater bubble of radioactive debris within the first 3 seconds. About 10 seconds later, those gases reached the water's surface, which created several spikes and plumes. Some reached maximum heights between 900 and 1,450 feet. A large mist cloud formed as those plumes settled back into the water. According to reports, the base surge grew to a radius of 4,600 feet and a maximum height of 1,900 feet. This testing aimed to see how vulnerable submarines were to underwater nuclear explosions. Wigwam was the first deep-water atomic test, and, to this day, the only test conducted deeper than 1,000 feet. After World War II, the Soviet Union kicked its nuclear program into high gear. Their first nuclear device was called Rossiya Делает Сама, or RDS-1. It translates to Russia Does It Itself. They launched their first test on August 29th of 1949. Things just got bigger from there. Up until the 1950s, all Soviet tests had been conducted above ground. Then, in 1954, the Russians built their first nuclear torpedo. They were eager to begin testing, so they searched for a site that would meet their needs. They found one in Novaya Zemlya, an archipelago in northern Russia. The frigid waters of the Kara Sea made for the perfect testing grounds away from civilization. On September 21st of 1955, the Russians detonated their new nuclear torpedo at a depth of 40 feet. It was small compared to what the US had at the time, only 3.5 kilotons, but that doesn't mean it didn't pack a punch. The Russians deployed 30 ships around the test site at distances between 1,000 feet and 5,200 feet from the explosion. These ships included 4 destroyers, 3 submarines, several seaplanes, and plenty of minesweepers. To test the radioactivity, they placed hundreds of animals on the vessels, including 500 goats and sheep and about 100 dogs. When the bomb went off, it immediately sank the closest battleship, stationed about 1,000 feet away. Other ships were damaged, but stayed afloat. 2 years later, the Russians returned to Novaya Zemlya with a new batch of bombs to test. The first test, on September 7th of 1957, was the only surface explosion at the island test site so far. It was a 32-kiloton bomb strapped to a 50-foot tower on the coast. Once again, they deployed animals, warships, and other military assets to test the damage. The explosion resulted in a crater over 260 feet wide and 50 feet deep. Radiation near the epicenter was 40,000 Röntgen per hour. To put that into perspective, a healthy dose of Röntgen is 2 per year. But the Soviets weren't done. Not yet. They still had another torpedo to test that was twice as powerful as the first one. On October 10th of 1957, the Russians detonated a 10-kiloton T-5 nuclear torpedo off the coast of Novaya Zemlya. The explosion occurred 60 feet deeper than the first one. The bigger bomb sank 3 destroyers, 3 submarines, 2 minesweepers, and many smaller target ships. Operation Hardtack is the code name given to the U.S. nuclear testing series between April 28th and October 31st of 1958. Hardtack saw 35 nukes detonated in various settings. These included high-altitude, surface-level, and underwater explosions. All but 2 tests took place in the Marshall Islands, now part of the Atomic Energy Commission's Pacific Proving Ground, or PPG. Hardtack was a major testing series for the U.S. Army. They exploded more nukes than were fired in all prior Pacific Ocean tests combined. Many of those explosions occurred on barges in the lagoon or deep in the open water. However, only 2 were detonated underwater: Wahoo and Umbrella. Wahoo was the first underwater test during Operation Hardtack. You could call it a continuation of Operation Wigwam. However, Wahoo was shallower and smaller, only yielding a 9-kiloton explosion at 500 feet deep. Like Wigwam, the Army set up ships around the blast site to measure the explosion's destructive power. The blast date was set for May 16th. Within seconds, Wahoo created a spray dome that was over 800 feet high. Smaller plumes appeared in every direction, with the vertical plume rising for 12 seconds after the blast. The spray dome itself was about 3,800 feet across by the 20-second mark. A target ship stationed about 3.4 miles away took a direct hit from the shockwave. It shook violently, but stayed afloat. But Wahoo was only the first part of Operation Hardtack's underwater testing. The second explosion, codenamed Umbrella, occurred on June 9th of 1958. They rigged the 8-kiloton bomb to a buoy and lowered it 150 feet into the lagoon. But before they detonated it, they towed the ships from the Wahoo test into the lagoon and stationed them around the bomb. Nuclear blasts in shallow water are known to leave craters. They wanted to see how the change in location might impact the damage to ships. It began as a clear June morning in 1958. A steady east-northeast wind blew between 15 and 17 knots, or 17 and 20 miles per hour. It was the perfect day to detonate a nuke. The spray dome breached the water's surface within 1/10 of a second. Within 20 seconds, the column reached a maximum height of 5,000 feet. Meanwhile, the base surge stretched for 6,000 feet in all directions. You could see it in the air for 25 minutes. The 8-kiloton blast left a 3,000-foot-wide crater in the lagoon's floor. However, it didn't damage the naval target ships beyond repair. They were fixed up and towed back for service in Pearl Harbor. One vessel, a merchant ship named the Moran, was damaged beyond repair and scuttled near Ikurin Island. Wahoo and Umbrella led to some key findings regarding nuclear weapons. Researchers discovered that underwater blasts create less fallout as the water absorbs radioactive material. While the base surge was highly radioactive, direct gamma radiation was extremely low. As for the shockwave, it wasn't enough to sink or damage military ships beyond repair. That said, some suffered equipment damage that rendered them immobile. Cold War tensions were reaching their boiling point in the early 1960s. President Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev were both impressed and concerned with the power of their respective countries' nuclear arsenal. One misunderstanding could end the entire world. The UK began building and testing its own bombs. Soon, nukes were going off in all corners of the remote world. All three superpowers tried to agree on a treaty, but trust was hard to come by. Meanwhile, France and China were busy detonating their first nukes. Then, after Russia promised to cease atmospheric testing, Khrushchev reneged on his word. In response, President Kennedy launched Operation Dominic, a series of 31 nuclear tests in 1962. It was to be the swiftest testing series to date, with 4 operations happening concurrently over 15 million square miles of the Pacific Ocean. These included airdrop tests, atmospheric tests, and ground-level explosions. For the underwater tests, Operation Dominic chose an area in the Pacific Ocean about 426 miles off the coast of San Diego. They wanted to test new weapon systems and free-fall bombs dropped from B-52s. One of those new systems was a nuclear-armed RUR-5A ASROC, or anti-submarine rocket. Here's how it works. Sonar picks up an enemy submarine and relays its position to a ship armed with an ASROC missile system. The attacking ship fires a missile that follows an unguided ballistic trajectory toward the target. The payload separates and enters the water at a predetermined point on that trajectory. This activates the torpedo, which uses its own sonar system to home in on the target and hit its mark. On May 11th of 1962, Operation Dominic put the new ASROC system to the test. The USS Agerholm identified its target over 2.5 miles away. It fired the ASROC and hoped for the best. The warhead separated after the booster rocket burned out. It entered the water and sank to about 650 feet before exploding. Operation Dominic was the last atmospheric test series conducted by the U.S. In 1963, the U.S. and USSR signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty in Moscow. The treaty prohibited all test detonations of nuclear weapons except for those conducted underground. If you enjoyed this video and want to see another just like it, then be sure to click the link on screen now. With that, thanks for watching, and be sure to tune in next time.